I'm Peter Bernstein. I'm the Managing Director of PS English. We teach English to Japanese people in London and all over the world.
Hi, I'm Pernille Rudline, Managing Director of Rudlin Consulting, the Europe, Middle East and Africa representative of Japan Intercultural Consulting. We provide consulting, research and cross-cultural communications training to Japanese companies and their partners around the world. So, welcome to our series about the top 3 things Japanese people find difficult about speaking in English. So, Peter, when and why did you set up PS English?
I started PS English in 2001. I was a private teacher teaching Japanese people and other nationalities in North London. I had my own little team of students. Gradually, though, I started to teach more and more Japanese students, and it became clear that there was a market for teaching English to Japanese people because of the hugely different requirements that Japanese people had.
Right. So what kind of Japanese students do you tend to get?
Our number one group are Japanese business people.
Right.
We teach them evenings, weekends, usually after work. Their families as well. And then there's a huge variety of academics, civil servants, self-employed people, university students and kids as well. So there's a huge variety, but I'd say Japanese expats in London over here for 2 to 5 years are our main group of students.
So that group then, the Japanese expats, well, what are the main issues that you find that they have?
The majority of students come to us saying the same thing, that they have issues communicating with native speakers, particularly with speaking and listening. Most Japanese students tell us that their writing's fine, their grammar's fine, they can read newspapers, but when it comes down to a simple business or social conversation, they struggle in many different ways.
Yeah, I think social conversation is also one that comes up a lot in my seminars as well. I try to sort of help them. It almost becomes an English lesson actually to help them with just how to do small talk. But I think you said that you make a distinction between small talk and kind of casual, everyday conversation. What do you mean by that?
I think there's a key issue that Japanese people find informal conversations extremely tricky and somehow feel that exposing too much of themselves in a conversation can somehow be seen as showing off or revealing too much about themselves, and therefore tend not to either answer questions comfortably or ask questions, which makes social conversations extremely awkward.
Yes. So what kind of things do you recommend they try to say then? If they don't want to talk about themselves, I mean, a clue would then be to get the other person to talk about themselves, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And one of our major pieces of advice is always ask questions, because if you're struggling in a social situation, maybe you're struggling to understand in a group situation, or you're struggling to express yourself, or you're shy or you're nervous, a simple question, such as how was your weekend?
Yeah, that's the classic, yeah.
Can be extremely helpful for the Japanese student. In our lessons, we sometimes provide a list of 10 or 20 quick, spontaneous questions and answers, where the students can practice, of course, answering those questions, which sometimes can be very difficult for them. Such as we said, how was your weekend? How was your family? What are you doing for Christmas? But asking them as well.
Yeah. I mean, I often say too that, of course, the British are not that communicative sometimes either. So when you say to somebody on a Monday morning, how was your weekend? Sometimes British people just go, oh, fine. And then, so what do you say to them as a sort of follow-up? What should you say then?
Yeah, true to a certain extent, although I find, from experience, I found that British people prefer talking about themselves about 300 times more than Japanese people. That advice about asking how was your weekend usually works.
Yeah, usually does.
If someone doesn't want to talk about themselves, then of course you've got to try other
ones,
other ways. Talking about the weather being the cliched.
That's the classic.
But it's amazing how talking about the weather, usually a very dull conversation, works and can break the ice in that slightly awkward conversation where people don't want to talk about themselves.
Yeah. What I often say is if a British person just says, fine, then you can say, did you get up to anything? But I think what sometimes Japanese people get slightly wrong then is they might say, what did you do at the weekend? Which is, of course, a bit too intrusive because obviously they might have done something they didn't want to talk about. But I think if you say, did you get up to anything? Then if the British person feels like opening up, they'll say, oh, yeah, I took the kids to, Thorpe Park or something. And then, of course, I think particularly as a manager, that is your moment, your clue. You've now discovered that your team member has children. And then you can say, oh, right, so how old are your kids? Then they'll say, oh, they're, 6 and 8. And then if you've got children of the same age, you've now got a kind of mutual interest, a source of small talk for the rest of your time in the UK, really, because you can now talk about your children.
Absolutely. I've yet to meet someone who doesn't like talking about their children. So going back to the question you asked, the question you suggested of did you get up to anything at the weekend, you will never hear, without instruction or advice, you'll never hear a Japanese person saying, no. Did you get up to anything at the weekend? Because it's a phrasal verb, talking technical English for the moment. It's a phrasal verb. It's a kind of expression that without instruction or advice, a Japanese person would never, ever use. No. So it's extremely important to become familiar with that, because not only will it help smooth out the social conversation, but also the knowledge of using that phrase will mean that a student will understand it when a native speaker says it.
Yeah. It's true. I mean, because the nice thing about that sort of expression is it's very vague. So you don't have to be specific about things. And actually in Japanese, it's the same thing. If you want to tell people that you've got something going on and therefore you have to leave the office, in Japanese you can just say, I've just got a thing I need to do. But conversely, I think when English native speakers are in Japan, they feel they have to somehow explain, that I need to go now because I have to go and pick my children up from school or something like that. You don't. You just have to say, I've got a thing I've got to do. That is the most tricky thing, is it? Just knowing those little catchphrases that work.
And also establishing which areas, beyond small talk and beyond talking about the weekend and the weather and the holidays and the children, which other topics are comfortable ones, which are both interesting to the native speaker, but also not too personal, not too controversial. And getting that right. There were 3 years when many people only wanted to talk about Brexit. Some would say it's not a particularly pleasant topic, no. But if you were comfortable holding a basic conversation about that topic, your conversations could go quite far. Another thing we have to make sure we cover in our lessons is that the students have basic awareness of the key sort of news, current affairs, cultural topics that people are talking about in their daily lives, whether it's Saturday night television, whether it's the latest podcast, or whether it's what's going on in the news with Harry and Meghan, or politics.
Preferably not politics and something a bit more lowbrow. I quite often say, when I was in Japan myself trying to get better at Japanese, I used to watch chat shows, quiz shows, because they're easy to follow. They also give you a kind of sense of what the current topics are. So I think all those horrible reality shows that I never watch in the UK, I would actually recommend a Japanese person to watch.
I would absolutely agree with you. And added to that, in certain situations, is sport.
Yes. Yeah, if you're into it, I mean, there's no point.
If you're interested in it, and if you're in an environment, for example, in a business environment where many of your colleagues are interested in sport,
there's some sweepstake going on, or a fantasy football team going on, or something like that, you need to join in.
Catching up in what's going on in the Premier League or the latest English cricket match, although I do accept that most Japanese people won't be on top of the latest.
But I mean, hooray for rugby though, right? Because that has been a fantastic icebreaker, I think, now. Most British and most Japanese would be happy to talk about the rugby, at least. Yeah.
Absolutely.